Let's tell you about this now. A Glencore subsidiary has been ordered to pay more than £275 million by a UK court for bribing African officials in a bid to gain access to oil. Between 2011 and 2016, the company paid representatives of crude oil companies in Nigeria, Cameroon and the Ivory Coast a total of $26 million through agents and employees. According to the prosecution, Glencore Energy UK workers and agents transferred the money to pay the bribes using private jets. Although South Africa was not implicated in Glencore's bribery scandal, Parliament's Portfolio Committee on Mineral Resources and Energy has recommended that the company's activities in the Republic of South Africa be investigated. To elaborate on these latest developments, we're now joined by independent analyst Khaya Sithole. Khaya, a very good morning to you, and thank you very much for availing yourself. So we understand that Glencore managed to pull this off by making unofficial advance payments. What does that mean?
Good morning, and good morning to the viewers. So the story is actually a fascinating one in that, according to both the United States and the United Kingdom authorities, Glencore essentially ran something that we call a cash desk. So what happened with that cash desk is that they would go and withdraw significant amounts of money, and they'd keep the hard currency in their offices. So when their officials needed to go to a hotspot, as we call it, a place where doing deals and getting access to contracts is not as linear as you and I might like it to be, then they would take that cash and obviously pay off whoever was necessary in order to open up the avenues for them to do business. They did that particularly in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, the Ivory Coast. So it was bribes that were being paid to officials in those countries in particular. And of course, those types of bribes and that type of conduct is expressly prohibited in the UK and the US jurisdictions. So once this was established, then those authorities could launch court cases against Glencore, and Glencore has conceded in both the US and the UK.
In trying to understand the DNA of corruption, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country that you cite, Glencore owns 2 copper and cobalt mines. In one example, it's alleged that $500,000 was paid to a judge to make a $16 million lawsuit against the company go away. How should we understand the relationship between the judiciary and corruption? How far and wide is it?
Well, I think in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, the systems are perhaps not as strong as they need to be. So if you look, for example, in South Africa, there's a reason that we say that judges have to be paid for life, and the fact that, constitutional court judges in particular will get their salary until they die. That is done in order to discourage judges that are nearing the end of their term in particular from then getting money being paid to them by people who want them to rule in a particular way. In other words, to take care of them beyond their retirement date. So that is one of the safeguards that we have implemented in South Africa. Unfortunately, it's not a universal practice, so I'm not sure if every other country in the continent, for example, has understood the risk of the judiciary being corrupted and has put appropriate safeguards there. So, of course, you can imagine that for anyone who's earning a salary as a civil servant in the Democratic Republic of Congo, $500,000 is probably the type of amount of money that they were never going to see in their lifetime. And if it's based on one transaction or one stroke of a pen that simply says guilty versus not guilty, and it gets you 500,000 rand, the incentives are quite clear there. So I think the problem that we have is that for as long as corruption persists, somebody will always find the right price to pay to someone, and obviously the judiciary is where you'd hope that such practices do not occur, but we cannot be naive to assume that they do not happen. In South Africa currently we have a magistrate that is on trial, Magistrate Nair, who obviously did the same thing in relation to Bosasa. So immunity from corruption and corrupt practices unfortunately does not exist in any arm of the state.
We understand that for crimes mostly that happened on the continent, Glencore will pay the United States, Great Britain, Brazil and possibly Sweden $1.1 billion, suggesting there's little to no reparations for the continent?
Well, the problem with the continent is that if they do not pursue the cases, it becomes difficult for them to even know what it is that they think they're entitled to. So the issue here is that if you use US dollars in particular in order to facilitate a particular transaction, whether corrupt or otherwise, that immediately gives the United States jurisdiction over that transaction wherever it was conducted. So, of course, for them, they simply looked at what they found as the evidence, and then they said on the basis of now the US dollar having been used to commit these acts of corruption, then they are free to chase Glencore, and of course they've been able to successfully do so. The problem with African countries is that they have very weak mechanisms for enforcing actions of this nature. They've got even weaker mechanisms for conducting the type of detailed forensic investigations that enable them to track exactly what happened. So you imagine that even in South Africa would struggle to establish that Glencore had a cash desk, would struggle to establish who was paid from that particular cash desk. So we have a glaring weakness in our law enforcement, which simply means that even when there's clear evidence that countries have been undermined and countries have lost out, they still do not recover anything.
Suggesting that this is a sophisticated game, and maybe if you want to play the game, maybe up the ante as well. Not to advocate for anything, but if you're going to do it properly. Is that what we're saying?
No. So the key problem here, unfortunately, is that when Glencore confessed what they'd done, other companies are not looking at this and saying that this is a lesson in what not to do. They simply see it as a lesson in how not to do it. So the reality here is that in African countries where law enforcement is weak and mineral resources are still the primary endowment there, we do know that many people do not use traditional means to get access to those concession rights. There's still significant acts of bribery and corruption that happen there. I think former President Thabo Mbeki has been very vocal in the past about the illicit money flows that happen in the continent. So what simply happens is that when one company is discovered, others look at that and then they simply say, well, don't do it that way, find a different way to do it. Because you know that it's quite pervasive and it's unlikely to be resolved anytime soon for as long as there are greedy politicians that control access to these vast mineral resources who are always happy to take a slice of the pie for themselves and rob their own countries.
To your point of those greedy politicians who rob their own people, that is alleged that in the case of Nigeria, some of the monies that were paid went towards a certain politician's election campaign. And so what is it that people on the ground can then do, right? So you hear of these sophisticated deals and these very precious monies that were transported via private jets onto the continent, but you don't see the trickle-down effect, especially when it comes to quality of life for people on the continent. What is it that then you and I can do? What options are available to us to turn things around, if anything at all?
Absolutely nothing. I think it would be a bit of an imposition to expect society to be able to deal with these things, because in most cases you'll never even hear about it. We'll never even know that these things happen. But what we do know is that countries like South Africa have started addressing the way in which politicians finance their political campaigns by asking for some element of transparency. So, of course, if you look at the Political Party Funding Act, for example, it then forces political parties to explain the source of their funding. Again, that is not a universal practice across Africa. So if there was an election campaign in Nigeria or the DRC tomorrow and somebody suddenly runs a very well-funded campaign, it is very difficult for ordinary citizens to be able to access the information that enables them to be able to not only establish that this person received a particular amount of money, but then also to be able to link it to a particular contract that then gets awarded to someone else. So until we have the right, tracing and enforcement mechanisms, a lot of citizens quite simply do not have sufficient power or authority to actually do much to stop these practices.
Is the fine enough? As we understand it, Glencore is expected to make a record $3.2 billion in the first half of 2022.
No, it is not. And if you look at the record profits that they've generated, particularly in the past 6 months, in the past year, on the back of the commodities boom, a fine will always pale in comparison to what those companies are able to generate as profits and as revenue. So we do not know what the right number will be, but you would have imagined that one of the best ways in which you can compensate society is to be able to take over those assets and actually return them back to the state, because these companies only end up controlling those assets on the basis of corrupt activities. So the right way to compensate society is to be able to restore those assets back to the public purse. But that doesn't seem to be one of the enforcement actions that has been proposed here.
So in a nutshell, the continent is not the exception to the rule when it comes to this corruption game.
It isn't, but it is the place where these corrupt practices are much easier to facilitate, given our very weak law enforcement capacity across the continent, and given how desperate our politicians tend to be, and given how difficult it is for citizens to be able to even ask difficult questions from politicians about where did you get this money? We cannot map the public salary that you receive versus the life that you lead in. So it is not an exception, but it is far more pervasive in Africa, given our vast endowment of mineral resources that are still essentially gold mine for all these companies.
Khaya Sithole is an independent analyst. Thank you.